In a packed Capitol hearing room, Jasmine Crockett locks eyes with Elon Musk after detonating the truth about a hidden AI network tracking 42 counties and millions of innocent people. No approval, no consent. In her hand is one file, 17 minutes long, powerful enough to crush his entire empire. The air crackles with tension as power and truth collide under Congress's unforgiving lights. What will Jasmine say that could shatter one of the world's most untouchable tech giants? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. 9 a.m. Room 216 of the U.S. Capitol was no longer just a hearing room. It was a pressure chamber. Every row was filled with national and international media, their tripods and lenses jammed shoulder to shoulder, fighting for the perfect shot. The air was thick with heat from the lights, every breath muffled by the weight of expectation. Jasmine Crockett entered first. She didn't rush. Her black suit was cut sharp, her hair pulled back so tightly it made her focus look unshakable. In her hands was a thick stack of files bound in black bands, edges worn from constant handling, pages inside rumored to be loaded with evidence no one had yet seen. She didn't acknowledge the cameras, didn't glance at the crowd. Each step was measured as if she'd rehearsed walking into this exact moment. She sat down, placed the files on the table with quiet finality, and folded her hands. Not a word. Not a movement wasted. 3 minutes ticked by, enough time for the tension to settle into everyone's spine, before the chamber doors swung open again. Elon Musk walked in, sunglasses on, dark tailored suit. The collar just slightly undone, as though he was above the formality of the occasion. A faint smirk pulled at one side of his mouth, calculated and deliberate for the flashing lenses that instantly swarmed him. He moved at his own pace, slow enough to own the room, fast enough to project control. Sliding into his chair, he didn't glance at Jasmine, only at the cameras as if they were the real audience. The official agenda on paper was straightforward. The Federal Audit Office had accused SpaceX and its subsidiary, Neurocore AI, of misusing more than $6.2 billion in taxpayer funds, buried under the label Public Administration Automation Technology. But everyone in that room knew the subtext. The whispers in congressional hallways and late-night newsrooms painted a far darker picture. One of a covert AI surveillance network already deployed in dozens of counties, monitoring citizens without their consent, without Congress ever voting on it. It wasn't just a budget line under scrutiny. It was a question of whether the tools of innovation had been weaponized against the very people they were meant to serve. The tension from the opening moments hadn't yet settled when the chairman of the committee leaned toward his microphone, ready to deliver the formal introduction. "This hearing will now come to order," he began, his voice steady, formal. "We are here to address serious allegations regarding the misuse of federal funds." His sentence was cut short as Elon Musk shifted forward in his seat, seizing the room with practiced ease. The interruption was deliberate, his tone pitched just loud enough to dominate over the chairman without needing to raise his voice. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to explain," he said, his words coated with a veneer of civility that felt more like a warning than gratitude. He let the phrase breathe for a moment, scanning the rows of lawmakers and press, then added with a slow, calculated drawl, "Technology moves faster than the law. I'm just the only one who understands it." The line landed like a gauntlet tossed across the table, equal parts arrogance and challenge, pulling a ripple of reaction from the audience, some leaning back in surprise, others leaning forward in anticipation. Jasmine Crockett didn't respond. Her posture didn't shift. Her eyes didn't narrow. She gave him nothing. Instead, with the calm precision of someone who knew exactly where this was going, she reached for the remote resting beside her files. A single press, and the screen behind her came alive, not with charts, not with cluttered graphics, but with one unflinching message in bold black type against a blinding white backdrop. "Public service automation is not a right to surveillance." The clarity of it was jarring, stripped of decoration, leaving no escape in interpretation. It wasn't an argument. It was a statement of fact, as cold and sharp as steel. The room froze. Conversations died mid-whisper. The energy shifted instantly from the buzz of curiosity to the heavy stillness of confrontation. the kind that makes even the air feel different. Every person in the chamber knew they had just crossed from formalities into a fight. The silence after Jasmine's opening slide felt heavy, like the air in the room had stopped moving. She let it stay that way for a few seconds. Her eyes locked on Musk, making sure every person there understood the weight of what was coming next. Then she leaned toward her microphone, speaking clearly and slowly, each word landing with purpose. This past January in Midland County, Texas, your AI system was deployed to record conversations inside a community center. There were over 1,700 separate recordings. Is that correct? Her question didn't wander, didn't soften. It went straight to the point, cutting through the tension and making people in the front rows shift in their seats. A few lawmakers turned to watch Musk's face, and reporters in the back raised their cameras. Ready. Musk answered without hesitation, his tone smooth but carrying a trace of arrogance. "We're helping them live smarter," he said, leaning back like he was in control of the room. "The AI learns how to analyze community needs so it can serve them better." His words sounded polished, almost like a line he'd practiced, carefully chosen to make the program seem harmless. But underneath, there was a challenge in his voice, as if daring anyone to disagree. Some members of the committee exchanged quick looks, comparing his explanation to the evidence they knew Jasmine was holding. Jasmine stayed completely still, her eyes never leaving him. She didn't look at her notes, didn't need to. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but sharper now, each word hitting harder. "You didn't ask permission, you didn't give notice. And you call that help?" The last word came out with an edge, almost like a blade. It wasn't just a question, it was a public accusation, the kind you couldn't dodge. The whole room went quiet again, waiting, the pressure building even higher. The tension from her last question still gripped the room when Jasmine reached for the remote again. She didn't rush. Her hand moved with the precision of someone about to deliver a blow they had been holding back for the exact right moment. "Let's take a look at something," she said, her voice even, almost calm, but the kind of calm that made people straighten in their seats. The lights dimmed slightly as the main screen came to life, and a video began to play. The first frame showed the front porch of a small, weathered house in Midland County. An elderly black woman, 82 years old, stood in the doorway, her posture slightly stooped, but her smile polite as she held a cream-colored envelope. In bold type across the top, the letter read, "Home Health Check Invitation." The footage followed her inside as she carefully opened it, revealing a neatly wrapped box tied with a ribbon, packaging that radiated reassurance and trust. She peeled the paper away, lifted the lid, and the camera zoomed in. Inside sat a small, black, polished device, its smooth surface marked only by a discrete NeuroCore AI insignia. A caption appeared over the freeze frame, its words stark and cold. "AI integrated microphone, GPS enabled, real-time data transmission." It wasn't medical equipment. It wasn't a wellness gift. It was surveillance, engineered to sit quietly in her home, listening, tracking, and feeding data straight into a system she had never heard of. Even on video, the moment was chilling. The contrast between the innocence of the gift's presentation and the cold reality of its purpose was enough to make several in the room lean forward, their expressions hardening as the footage held on the device. Across the table, a Republican congressman leaned forward, clearly preparing to object, his mouth opening and his hands starting to rise. But before he could speak, the second half of the clip rolled. The feed shifted to a live transmission map, digital lines pulsing across a U.S. map, red dots blinking in sequence as they converged on a single location. The caption labeled it with unnerving precision. "Destination, SpaceX headquarters, Hawthorne, California." The link was undeniable. The congressman froze mid-motion, his hand lowering as he pressed himself back into his seat. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The stillness wasn't quiet. It was electric, humming with the collective realization of what had just been shown. This was no longer an allegation. It was proof, visual and irrefutable. In that instant, the hearing crossed a line it could never return from. The tension in the room was suffocating. Jasmine's evidence still hung heavy in the air, But Elon Musk, always ready for the spotlight, moved quickly to answer. With the faintest smirk, he leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished table. Every camera locked onto him, following each movement as if waiting for the next dramatic turn in this unfolding scene. "Let me make something clear," Musk said, his tone smooth and calculated. "This isn't about secrecy. It never was." He reached for a leather folder in front of him and slid a single sheet across the table. Musk confidently placed the Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, before the committee, clearly believing it could wipe away all doubt. The message on the page was simple: authorized by the Department of Energy to deploy AI solutions for community services. Resting his hands on the paper like it was his lifeline, he spoke in a calm, steady voice. "This MOU grants permission to test AI technologies that will improve public services," Musk explained, every word soaked in self-assurance. "No malintent, no hidden agenda, just solutions to modernize our systems and serve the people." For a moment, the entire room seemed to ease, as if this piece of official paper could justify everything Musk had done. The earlier accusations had painted a much darker picture, but now Musk was offering an official, government-approved answer. He had the document. He had the signatures. What more could be said? Jasmine Crockett, seated at the far end of the table, didn't so much as blink. With deliberate precision, she reached into her folder and pulled out another document, sliding it across the table without breaking eye contact. The room fell still. This wasn't another part of Musk's defense. This was the reality. She pressed a button, and a PDF file appeared on the large screen behind her. The projector flickered before revealing the document in full. "This," Jasmine said, her voice steady and controlled, "is the appendix to the MOU you just presented. At first glance, it might look legitimate, but there's one problem." She let the pause hang in the air, her words pressing down on the silence, before clicking the remote again. The image zoomed in on the document's timestamps. "The dates have been altered, and the signature at the bottom? That's not valid. It's a forged electronic signature. There is no official notary, no verification, just a manipulated file you've presented as legitimate." The room went dead quiet. The background murmur of uncertainty disappeared completely. Musk's confident expression faltered. His eyes shifted from the screen to the committee members, his posture tightening. For the first time, the calm, carefully built image he carried was starting to crack. In front of everyone, he had been caught. His supposed proof was nothing more than a forged document. Jasmine's gaze stayed fixed on him. "You thought this MOU would shield you," she continued, her voice steady but heavy with conviction. "You thought a piece of paper would make you untouchable, that a signature would give you immunity. But what you've done here isn't about innovation. It's about fraud. This is criminal." Her words sliced through the room like a blade. This was no accident, no misunderstanding. It was a calculated act of deception. Musk opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. For the first time, the image of the fearless innovator wavered. The people in the room could feel it. His empire of influence was breaking apart under the weight of her evidence. Jasmine had shown him not as a visionary serving the public, but as someone who had exploited the system for his own ends. This wasn't about helping communities. It was about watching them, controlling them, all without their consent. The silence that followed was heavy and unbroken. Every face in the room reflected the same understanding of what had just happened. Musk had no clever retort, no sales pitch to save him. The MOU he had relied on so heavily had been stripped bare, exposed as a hollow, fraudulent shield. Jasmine didn't need to speak louder. Her proof had done all the work. Musk had built his image as the genius ahead of his time. But in the face of her calm, unshakable challenge, he was just a man caught in the act. The room felt like it was holding its breath. All eyes were locked on Jasmine Crockett as she delivered her final blow, her calm, steady voice slicing through the hours of mounting tension. The weight of her words, backed by the undeniable evidence she had shown, hung over everyone. But Elon Musk wasn't about to let her have the last say. His hands, which had been still on the table, began tapping in impatience. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing on Jasmine with a cold, sharp glare. The smooth, polished businessman persona he wore so easily was slipping away. Now he looked like a man cornered, realizing that the story he had built about innovation and progress was coming apart. The charm was gone, replaced by frustration leaking through the cracks. "You're twisting my words," he snapped, his voice rising in anger. He slammed his palm on the table, the sound echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. "I'm not here to monitor people. I'm here to help them. This is about technology improving lives, not spying on anyone." His words were forceful, almost desperate, as he leaned forward. He wanted badly for everyone to see him as the hero, not the villain Jasmine was making him out to be. Jasmine didn't even blink. She stayed calm, composed, her eyes locked on him. She had seen this play before. The deflection, the outburst, the attempt to take back control. Musk's anger wasn't really aimed at her. It was aimed at the truth she had just placed in front of him. "You can call it help all you want," she replied, her tone cutting clean through his words. "But at the end of the day, you're watching them, tracking them, without their knowledge, without their consent. And that, Mr. Musk, is not help, it's surveillance." The word hit hard. The silence afterward was deafening. Surveillance wasn't just a term, it was a reality. It meant real people, living their lives, unaware they were being watched. Jasmine's words weren't just an accusation. They pulled back the curtain on the harm being done. Those Musk claimed to help were actually being mined for data, for influence, for control. Musk's eyes burned with anger. His posture tightened, the tension visible. "Are you trying to turn the public against me?" he shot back. "Are you trying to make me the enemy of this country, Crockett?" The emotion in his voice was raw now, his earlier calm gone. There was no more mask, only frustration spilling out. He was a man who had spent years building an empire, only to watch it begin to unravel in real time, with Jasmine holding the thread. Jasmine stayed exactly as she was, poised, unshaken. Her gaze never moved from his. "I don't need to make you the enemy, Mr. Musk," she said evenly. "You've already done that. You're doing it right now, one data point at a time." Her words rang through the room, sharp and deliberate. Musk was no longer just a visionary in the eyes of the room. He was a man who had betrayed the trust of the people he claimed to serve. His data wasn't about service, it was about control, hidden behind a false promise of help. Jasmine had made that reality impossible to ignore. The silence that followed was suffocating. Musk's mouth opened, then closed, searching for an answer that wouldn't come. The smirk, the clever quips, none of it could save him now. He had been stripped bare, not by advanced tech or some complex legal trap, but by the plain, unshakable truth. He had crossed a line. Just then, as if sensing the moment was about to spiral, the committee chair's voice broke through. "Order in the room," he commanded, louder and firmer than before. "We will proceed with respect and decorum." But the damage was already done. The truth was out, and Musk's image as the untouchable genius was shattered. Jasmine had made her case, calmly and without blinking. She had forced the truth into daylight, and now the world would see the man not as a savior, but as someone who built his empire on control. And she knew this was only the first strike. Many more were coming. The room felt heavy with the weight of what had been revealed. Every eye stayed fixed on the screen, every breath held as Jasmine Crockett prepared to deliver her final, most devastating piece of evidence. The documents, the contracts, the testimony, they had all built to this point. But now she was about to give the committee something far more personal, far more damning. She pressed a button on the remote, and the image flickered before coming into sharp focus. The silence was absolute, the anticipation so thick it was almost suffocating. A live feed appeared, showing a figure in shadow, his face hidden by digital distortion. His voice, altered to conceal his identity, crackled faintly through the speakers, carrying a sense of urgency. "This man," Jasmine began, her tone steady but firm, "is a former lead engineer at Neurocore AI. He worked directly on the design and deployment of the surveillance systems running across the country. He's here today to tell you exactly what's been happening inside Musk's companies." Even through the distortion, the man's voice carried guilt and regret. I was part of a system, he said, clipped and deliberate, that didn't just gather data. It rated people. Every person who used our AI systems got a compliance score. That score determined whether they got benefits, access to essential services, or even a chance at public housing. The impact of those words hit the room like a physical shock. The air seemed to stop moving. Committee members exchanged tense glances, the weight of the claim sinking in. This wasn't theory anymore. It wasn't speculation. It was happening. Real people, judged and denied by an algorithm that reduced them to nothing more than numbers in a machine built for efficiency, not humanity. The whistleblower's voice became sharper, frustration leaking through the distortion. And it didn't end there. The data wasn't just stored, it was sold to local governments and municipalities all over the country. They used it to decide where resources went, who got help, and who was left behind. People's lives were being shaped by a system they didn't control, one they didn't even know was watching them. Jasmine let the words hang in the air, letting the truth settle like dust in the chamber. Her eyes stayed locked on Musk. She knew this was the moment everything changed. Contracts and technical defenses wouldn't save him now. Real people's lives had been caught in his network of surveillance, their futures altered without their knowledge or permission. A low murmur of disbelief spread through the room. Committee members' faces showed shock, anger, and a deep sense of betrayal. They had bought into the vision of progress, the gleaming promise of innovation. Now they were seeing what was really behind it. The room erupted. A Republican congressman, silent until now, shot to his feet, his voice shaking with fury. "This is criminal," he shouted, the words ringing through the chamber. "We need the FBI involved. Now." His outrage was clear. He fully understood the seriousness of what had been laid out. The air buzzed with urgency. Members whispered to one another, some glancing toward the chairman for direction, but Jasmine remained still, steady. She didn't need to speak. The point was made. Musk's grand system, the empire built on promises of technology and progress, had been exposed as a machine for control, exploitation, and stripping people of their most basic rights. Musk, once composed and in command, now looked unsettled. His gaze darted between the screen, the lawmakers, and Jasmine. His trademark confidence, the same that had let him dominate any room, was slipping away. He shifted in his seat, his fingers restless as he searched for a way to pull back control. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She had laid the truth bare, and there was no undoing it. The whistleblower's shadowed face stayed on the screen, a chilling reminder of the reality Musk had hidden. He might have built rockets and electric cars, but he had also built a surveillance empire, and now it stood wide open for the world to see, because Jasmine Crockett had torn off the mask. Silence reclaimed the room, the weight of what had been revealed still pressing down like the calm before a storm. Jasmine knew this was only the start. Musk may have believed money could shield him, that his empire was untouchable. But now the world had seen the truth, and she had made sure they would never forget it. The air in the chamber was thick, Jasmine's last words still echoing in the silence. Musk's confidence, his polished defense, was beginning to show cracks. The evidence against him was too strong to ignore, and with each word, Jasmine was cutting deeper into the carefully crafted image of the untouchable tech mogul he had built for years. But Musk wasn't ready to surrender. Leaning forward slightly, his face tightened with frustration. His voice stayed calm, but there was an edge to it now, a trace of agitation breaking through. "Let's be clear," he said, his tone firm. "We do not collect biometric data. We do not use facial recognition technology in any of our systems." His eyes swept the room as if daring someone to challenge him. "The data we collect is only for improving public services. There is no invasion of privacy." Jasmine didn't flinch. She clicked her remote, bringing up a new slide on the big screen. This wasn't just another chart or statistic. It was a technical deployment plan signed off by several of Musk's top engineers. The title was plain enough: Face Map V4. But the content told a different story: specifications, launch dates, and implementation codes for a nationwide facial recognition program. A ripple ran through the crowd as the document lit up the screen. Jasmine's eyes locked on Musk. She was calm, but there was steel in her tone. "Mr. Musk," she said evenly, Are you aware that as of March this year, 423 facial recognition cameras were installed across 13 neighborhoods, from Chicago to New Orleans? Her voice sharpened. And are you aware these cameras are connected to the very system you've been calling innovative? The impact was immediate. Musk's confident mask faltered. His eyes narrowed slightly as the weight of her question settled in. The whispers in the room grew louder. This was no longer about innovation. This was about control, and Musk was at the center of it. The silence stretched. Musk's lips pressed into a thin line, his body still but tense. The sharp, ready comebacks he was known for weren't coming. He had walked in expecting to dominate. Now he was on the defensive. Jasmine let the moment linger, watching him closely. She could see the subtle signs, the restless fingers on the table's edge, the stiffness in his shoulders. He was losing his grip. The room was turning, and for once Musk wasn't in control. Still, he tried to push back. He glanced at his legal team, his jaw tightening before looking back to the panel, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. "That's," he began, but his lawyer quickly rose to cut him off. "We request a brief recess," the attorney said, his voice carrying a faint tremor. "For my client's mental well-being, we ask for a short break. The intensity of this hearing is affecting his ability to continue." It was a weak attempt to take back control. Jasmine watched him with an unshaken expression. She knew this tactic. She'd seen it before. This wasn't about mental strain. It was about slipping away from the truth that had just cornered him. "A break," she repeated, her voice cool but laced with edge. She looked from the lawyer back to Musk. "No, Mr. Musk, there will be no break. The people you've been tracking and controlling don't get breaks. They don't get to pause their lives when they're being reduced to data points in your system." She leaned forward, her voice steady but sharper now. "People have lived under the weight of your decisions, and now that the truth is out, you want to step away? You want a mental break?" Her words hung in the room, sharp and unyielding. "Accountability doesn't stop for the rest of us. It won't stop for you." There was a shift in the atmosphere. The committee chair, sensing the rising tension, spoke with authority. "There will be no recess," he declared. "The hearing will continue." Musk stayed quiet. His eyes flickered toward the door for a moment before returning to the panel. There was no way out. The truth was on the record, and Jasmine had boxed him in. The room, fully aware of what had just happened, settled into silence again. Jasmine's point had landed, and Musk had no escape. Just the heat of the spotlight and the weight of the evidence pressing down on him. The minutes passed slowly, everyone waiting to see if he would speak, but deep down they all knew. There was no way back for him now. Outside the hearing room, the story had exploded far beyond Capitol Hill. It was now a full-blown national event. As the committee chair's ruling echoed inside, television crews stationed on the Capitol steps sprang into action. News vans lined the street, satellite dishes aimed skyward, sending the images out to millions. Control rooms at every major network scrambled to cut directly to the live feed. Anchors leaned forward over their desks, voices tight with urgency, aware that what was unfolding could sway public opinion in a matter of minutes. Across the country, in homes, offices, and public spaces, screens were filled with a single bold headline: "Jasmine Crockett exposes Elon Musk's citizen surveillance program." There was no hedging, no careful language. This was stated as fact. Footage from the hearing looped on repeat. Jasmine presenting damning documents, Musk shifting in his seat, the exact moment his lawyer requested a recess. On split screens, the live hearing played beside panels of analysts, each ready to dissect every gesture, every pause, every word. Local stations raced to give the story a personal angle. In Chicago, a midday anchor stood outside City Hall, pointing to highlighted portions of a leaked deployment map. Chicago is one of the cities identified in the congressional evidence, where hundreds of facial recognition cameras have allegedly been installed without public notice. In New Orleans, a reporter stood on a busy street corner, holding up printed slides from the hearing that showed neighborhood-level details. Meanwhile, social media platforms were ablaze with debate. Supporters of Musk's program defended it as a necessary layer of protection in uncertain times, while critics denounced it as an invasion of privacy on a scale the country had never seen. Video clips circulated at lightning speed. Jasmine's calm, precise questioning, the moment Musk faltered, and still images of the elderly woman from the earlier video discovering the hidden device in her gift box. Radio talk shows devoted entire hours to the hearing. One host called it the most important privacy scandal of the decade, demanding immediate federal action. Another defended Musk, saying the outrage was manufactured political theater against a man who had done more for technological progress than anyone in Washington. In coffee shops, people clustered around laptops and phones, their conversations breaking into heated whispers. Office break rooms turned into impromptu viewing stations, where employees exchanged theories about how far the program might have reached. For some, the revelations were shocking. For others, they confirmed long-held suspicions about the hidden cost of convenience and innovation. On television, the analysis was relentless. Former prosecutors reviewed the timing of the recess request, calling it a clear sign of legal panic. Technology experts broke down the FaceMap V4 document in simple terms, explaining exactly how such a system could track individuals in real time. One network aired side-by-side clips. Musk's firm denial of using facial recognition, followed immediately by the projected deployment plan bearing his engineers' signatures. Reporters outside the Capitol battled to be heard over the noise of gathering protesters. Some carried signs reading, "Security isn't spying," while others held placards declaring, "Stop the surveillance state." Chants and shouts cut through the live broadcasts, underscoring the intensity of the public's reaction. Editorial teams debated how to frame the moment in print. Many opted for direct, dramatic language. One major paper's website led with a striking black and white image of Jasmine pointing at the projection screen while Musk sat in the background, his expression tight. The headline beneath it read, "Congressional Hearing Unveils Musk Surveillance Program, Nation Reacts." In living rooms and on commuter trains, people argued in real time. One viewer commented on a live stream, "If this is true, it's a betrayal of trust." Another countered, "If it keeps us safer, it's worth it." The divide wasn't just political, it was cultural, cutting across age, region, and background. Political analysts predicted ripple effects, new federal oversight of private tech companies, a wave of state-level privacy legislation, and a permanent shift in how Americans viewed the balance between security and personal freedom. The consensus was clear. This hearing had permanently altered the national conversation. Even entertainment programs couldn't resist weighing in. Late-night monologues replayed Jasmine's sharp exchanges with Musk, adding dramatic pauses for laughs, but the laughter was uneasy, edged with the recognition that the subject was deadly serious. And through it all, the live feed from the hearing continued to roll. Every glance, every silence, every shift in tone was broadcast instantly to millions. The narrative had already been set. Jasmine Crockett had stood her ground against one of the most powerful figures in tech, and in doing so, she had ignited a debate that was now consuming the country. The fight between technological security and personal freedom was no longer an abstract policy discussion. It was unfolding in real time under the relentless gaze of the public eye. The shift in the room was almost imperceptible at first. A tightening of shoulders, a faint rustle of paper, a subtle change in breathing patterns, but it spread like a ripple in still water. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of it all, a single sheet of paper in her hand. It wasn't just another exhibit, it was the culmination of hours of testimony, documents, and pointed questioning. The committee members leaned forward in their seats, their attention narrowing on her like a camera lens pulling into focus. She let the silence work for her, holding the moment until the tension felt almost unbearable. Then, without a hint of theatrics, she began. "This," she said, placing the report onto the evidence table, "is the final report." The words landed with a quiet weight, drawing the eyes of every person in the chamber. She explained it plainly. 4 states, all of them having accepted funding for AI surveillance cameras, and all of them tracing that funding back to the same source. It wasn't a tech budget. It wasn't a law enforcement grant. It was money taken from budgets meant to help disabled children, funds that had been quietly reclassified under the category of assistive learning devices. The reallocation was deliberate, calculated, and hidden under layers of bureaucratic language so dense that most people would never think to question it. A murmur ran through the gallery, the sound quickly swallowed by the gravity of what she'd just said. She didn't raise her voice, didn't pound the table. She didn't need to. The facts were doing the heavy lifting now, each one sharper than any insult or accusation could ever be. Eyes turned instinctively toward Musk, but he sat motionless, his expression unreadable. Jasmine didn't look at him yet. Her gaze stayed on the report, as if even she could barely believe the audacity of it. When she finally looked up, her eyes locked on Musk like a spotlight cutting through smoke. Her voice was calm, but it carried the kind of stillness that always comes before a storm. With all your genius, she asked, why do you still need to watch every citizen just to feel powerful? She didn't blink. The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, impossible to misinterpret. It wasn't just a question, it was an indictment, wrapped in the skin of curiosity. The hearing room went dead quiet, not the kind of quiet that comes from politeness, but the kind that creeps in when people are holding their breath, afraid that even the sound of air moving might shatter the moment. Somewhere to Jasmine's left, the committee clerk clicked the top of his pen, a small metallic snap that echoed louder than it should have. It was the only sound in the room. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed to fade under the weight of her question. Musk's posture shifted ever so slightly, his hands resting on the table, flattened out as if grounding himself. For years, he had dominated rooms like this with sheer confidence, dismantling critics with rapid-fire logic or sidestepping them with calculated humor. But there was no easy detour here. Jasmine's words weren't about profit margins or innovation charts. They were about power, control, and morality. And there was no graph or shareholder letter that could make that look good. Jasmine stayed perfectly still, the paper in front of her untouched now, her silence forcing the weight of the question to rest squarely on Musk's shoulders. She could have followed it with statistics, with more testimony, with another round of damning evidence. But she didn't. She knew the power of a moment left to breathe. Around them, the committee members glanced at each other, some with brows furrowed, others leaning back as if trying to process the magnitude of what they just heard. It wasn't lost on anyone in that chamber what this meant. Money intended for some of the country's most vulnerable children, kids who needed specialized tools to communicate, to learn, to navigate a world already stacked against them, had been siphoned off to build surveillance systems that watched everyone. This wasn't just unethical, it was personal. The betrayal was layered. Betrayal of trust, betrayal of purpose, betrayal of the public. The air seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. In the front row of the gallery, a woman in a navy blazer pressed her lips together tightly, her eyes locked on the floor as though the truth was too ugly to meet head-on. A few seats down, a man in a gray suit shook his head slowly, his jaw tense, his gaze fixed on Musk. No one reached for their phones. No one coughed. No one dared to break the silence that had settled over them. Musk glanced toward the chairman, then back to Jasmine. There was a flicker in his eyes. Whether it was calculation, defiance, or something else entirely, no one could tell. But it was clear that her question had landed exactly where she wanted it to. And in that moment, with the room frozen and the truth laid bare between them, Jasmine didn't look like just a member of Congress. She looked like the one person in the room who wasn't afraid to strip away every layer of pretense until only the truth was left. The pen clicked again, sharp in the stillness, like a metronome marking the seconds Musk had yet to answer. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't speak. She let the silence keep pressing down, knowing that sometimes the absence of words could be louder than the most explosive testimony. And for the first time in the entire hearing, Musk didn't seem to have a ready line, a clever deflection, or a technical explanation. All he had was the question, and the weight of everyone in that room waiting to see if he could answer it. The air inside the hearing room had shifted again, but this time it wasn't the charged anticipation that came before a clash. This was heavier, slower, the kind of silence that doesn't just fill a space, it owns it. Every sound seemed exaggerated in its absence. The faint hum of the overhead lights, the slow mechanical whir of a camera lens adjusting, the distant cough of someone in the gallery. No one wanted to move first. No one wanted to break the moment, because they all understood, instinctively, without a word, that they were watching something unravel. Musk didn't answer right away. In the seconds after Jasmine's final question, his eyes held hers for just long enough to acknowledge it, then drifted down. Not in defiance, not in calculated disinterest, but in something quieter, almost involuntary, like gravity had suddenly pulled his attention away from the world around him. His gaze landed on the smooth surface of the table in front of him, but it was clear he wasn't looking at it. His mind was somewhere else entirely, and whatever he was thinking, it wasn't a victory lap. His right hand flexed once, fingers curling against the padded armrest of his chair. The leather creaked softly under the strain, and then the grip tightened until his knuckles blanched white. The movement was small, almost invisible, but it carried more weight than any statement he could have made. This wasn't a man about to launch into a prepared speech. This was a man holding on. To what, no one could tell. The committee chair leaned forward slightly, his voice cutting through the room like a gavel strike. "Mr. Musk will need your closing statement." His tone was firm but measured, the way an experienced jurist might handle a witness on the verge of collapse. It was protocol, nothing more. But in this moment, protocol had the edge of finality. The words were not a request. They were the line between this man's last chance to defend himself and the official record closing without him. For a moment, Musk didn't move. His elbows stayed locked against the armrests, his shoulders squared but motionless, his head still bowed. The pause stretched just long enough to make people wonder if he would answer at all. And then, in the faintest shift, his jaw moved. His lips parted. When the words came, they didn't belong to the microphone in front of him. "We're all afraid of chaos," he said quietly, the sentence slipping into the room like a confession overheard through a closed door. "I'm just trying to keep this world from falling apart." It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a rebuttal. It was something else. The cadence was uneven, the tone stripped of the confidence that had defined every public appearance he'd ever made. It didn't sound like a man making his case. It sounded like a man trying and failing to convince himself. The words hung in the air, soft but heavy. A few people in the gallery leaned forward instinctively, as though volume alone could add weight to what they'd heard. But no one moved to fill the silence that followed. Even the chairman, who usually followed statements with a brisk thank you or a procedural note, stayed still. Because everyone in that room knew, whether they admitted it aloud or not, that something irreversible had just happened. The sentence wasn't enough to rebuild what had been dismantled in the past hours. It didn't wipe away the evidence, the revelations, the questions he hadn't answered. If anything, it made them sharper. Musk's gaze didn't rise again. His eyes stayed locked on the table, as if there were something written there only he could see. Around him, the committee members' faces were unreadable, but not in the way they had been before, when neutrality was an act of discipline. This was different. This was the kind of stillness that comes when the verdict is already written in the room's collective mind, even if no one has said it aloud. One aide shifted in their seat, adjusting a stack of papers. The sound of the pages brushing against one another seemed to echo far louder than it should have. Another aide's pen clicked once, a sharp, hollow note in the vacuum of noise. Even the low hum of the air conditioning unit at the far end of the chamber seemed louder, like the building itself was leaning in to hear the end of something. There was no defense mounted, no fiery final word. He didn't lift his head to meet the chairman's eyes again. He didn't challenge the framing of the discussion, didn't reassert the narrative that had carried him for years. Whatever playbook had guided him before had been set down, or maybe it had just stopped working. The gavel came down once, not hurried, but with the weight of closure. The sharp crack it made against the wood startled no one. It was the official signal that the session had ended, but it also carried something less tangible. The quiet acknowledgement that the room had just witnessed the last flicker of a certain kind of power. Musk remained seated for a few seconds after the gavel strike, his hands still gripping the armrests. He didn't immediately rise or collect his papers. He didn't make eye contact with the press pool lining the back wall. It was as though he knew that standing would mean leaving, and leaving would mean facing the world outside this room. a world that had just seen him in a way he'd spent his entire career avoiding. The people in the chamber didn't whisper or shuffle out. They moved slowly, deliberately, as though each step carried the weight of what they had just watched. Some avoided looking at him entirely. Others glanced just once, then quickly looked away, not out of respect, but because there was something uncomfortable about seeing someone so publicly unmasked. By the time the reporters' phones lit up with breaking news alerts, the narrative had already solidified. The first headline to hit the airwaves would frame it bluntly: the collapse of a tech empire. Others would add their own variations, some more sympathetic, others cutting to the bone, but all circling the same unshakable truth: that in those last minutes, whatever control Musk had over the room, over the story, over his own image, had slipped entirely from his grasp. It wasn't just about policy anymore. It wasn't even just about power. It was about the moment when the myth gave way to the man, and the man had no answer left that anyone wanted to hear. The sound of the gavel still lingered behind her, not as a single strike, but as a phantom that kept reverberating in her chest. Jasmine pushed through the tall double doors of the Capitol hearing room, stepping into the marble-lined hallway where the air felt sharper, almost metallic, like stepping from the heat of a forge into cold night air. She didn't stop to look back. The weight of the chamber was still clinging to her shoulders, and the hallway ahead was already alive, buzzing, vibrating, swelling with something she could feel before she saw it. Then the wall of cameras hit. The sudden flash was blinding, a white-hot strobe that ricocheted off the polished walls and ceiling, turning the corridor into a lightning storm. The hum of conversation turned into a swarm, a dozen voices stacking over each other, each one trying to punch through the noise with a question. Microphones, black foam heads clustered like a field of blunt spears, were thrust so close to her face they almost brushed her cheek. Some reporters shouted her name. Others barked headlines before they'd even gotten her attention. Every lens was hunting the same thing: a crack, a twitch, anything that could be looped endlessly on the evening broadcast. Security moved in tight, 4 officers forming a living barrier, their arms out, trying to keep a buffer between her and the crush. But the press didn't care about the buffer. They surged with the momentum of a wave, feet shuffling in sharp bursts, cameras hoisted high over heads, boom mics diving into the space above her like fishing lines cast into deep water. Someone shouted a question about Musk. Someone else demanded a comment on the committee's findings. It was a wall of noise, a single unbroken shout made from 100 different throats. Jasmine kept walking, one step, then another. She kept her chin level, her eyes forward, her hands loose at her sides. The floor beneath her heels felt cold through the thin leather soles, and every step echoed too loudly, each sound bouncing off marble and tile, cutting through the press of bodies. She didn't quicken her pace. She didn't slow down. Every instinct told her to guard her face, to protect the still-burning adrenaline from leaking into her expression. But she knew better. The cameras didn't just record, they dissected. One flicker of triumph, one trace of anger, one visible breath of exhaustion could be torn from the whole and made to stand alone, stripped of the truth it belonged to. Halfway to the rotunda, the crowd swelled tighter. The walls closed in, the ceiling arched above like the inside of a bell, magnifying every sound, every shuffle, every cough. Reporters jostled for angles, shoulders bumping, elbows digging. A man in a gray suit and press badge pushed forward hard enough to brush her arm, his recorder held out like an accusation. Her security detail shifted instantly, closing the gap, but the shove of bodies didn't stop. Then cutting through the chaos came one voice, clear, precise, and louder than the rest. Not because of volume, but because of its aim. "Do you think you've won?" The question was a sudden spike in the noise, sharp enough to pierce it. It hung there for a second, weighty, visible almost, as if the words themselves had taken on mass. The hallway's current shifted around it. The cameras stopped panning in frantic sweeps and locked on her instead. Even the reporters who hadn't asked it turned their heads to see if she would answer. It wasn't just a question, it was a trap. A win meant gloating, a loss meant weakness. Any crack could be spun, repackaged, replayed. Jasmine stopped walking. The crowd didn't expect it. The forward surge faltered, heels scuffing, cameras jerking in surprise. She didn't turn fully, not yet. She let the pause stretch, not for show, but for control, a heartbeat's worth of silence to make sure when she spoke, the words would own the air. The flashes continued, but slower now, as if even the photographers knew the moment was narrowing in on something sharp. When she finally turned, it was only enough for the lenses to catch her face. No squaring of the shoulders, no hunting for the spotlight, no shift into the rehearsed posture that politicians so often reach for. She didn't wear victory, and she didn't wear defeat. Her expression was stripped down to its steel core. Calm, unshaken, the adrenaline cooled into something colder and harder. She didn't smile. She didn't smirk. She didn't give them anything that could be mistaken for self-congratulation. When she spoke, her voice was low and even, a scalpel rather than a hammer. We don't need genius. We need truth. The words cut through the hallway, not shouted, not amplified, but honed. They landed clean, without an ounce of apology or theater. And in that precise delivery was the most dangerous thing she could give them: clarity. There was no space for misinterpretation, no room to twist the meaning. It was the kind of line that didn't just answer a question, it closed a door. For one suspended beat, the entire hallway seemed to go still. The usual scramble of follow-up questions didn't come right away. Instead, the sound that rose was mechanical. The rapid-fire click of shutters, the whir of autofocus, the quick slap of camera mirrors capturing frame after frame. Photographers leaned in, some crouching low, others standing on tiptoe, all angling for the same image. Her face lit in stark relief against the marble and chaos. The exact second her words hung between them. Somewhere in the crowd, a producer barked into a headset, already feeding the line into a control room. Across the hallway, a reporter with a battered notepad was scribbling the words in block letters, underlining them twice. In the far corner, a cameraman mouthed the sentence silently as he replayed it in his head, committing it to memory. Within minutes, the hallway was no longer just a hallway. It was the first stage of the story's second life. Phones were already out in the press corps, fingers flying as push notifications were crafted. Breaking, Crockett. We don't need genius. We need truth. The phrase, already boiled down to its sharpest form, was headed for timelines, banners, and front pages. Some reporters were still asking questions, but it didn't matter. This was the clip. This was the headline. Even as the press tried to pivot, the weight of her words was pulling all gravity toward itself. She turned back toward the path ahead, her security closing ranks once more, and the crowd began to follow, not to chase her, but to carry the moment forward. By the time she reached the far end of the corridor, editors in newsrooms miles away were staring at those 7 words on their screens, testing them in bold, stacking them over the image of her in the glare, unblinking. The New York Times would run it above the fold. Time would center it on a cover photo. The Guardian would stretch it across 2 columns, letting the white space frame it like an unbroken wall. It had started as a question in the chaos of a Capitol hallway. Now, even before she stepped outside into the waiting line of cameras and live trucks, it had already transformed into something else. An answer that didn't just belong to her, but to anyone who still believed the truth could be spoken plainly, without permission, and still hold the power to stop a crowd in its tracks. The hallway didn't fall silent because the cameras stopped clicking. It fell silent because every person there knew they had just heard something that wouldn't fade when the lights went down. Even the echo of her words seemed to stand in the air, refusing to leave. It was not the kind of line that belonged to one press cycle. It was the kind that sank in, traveled with people, and demanded they repeat it later, at dinner tables, in classrooms, in places where cameras never reached. Jasmine didn't slow down to enjoy the effect. She just kept walking, her pace steady, as if she knew the real fight was still ahead. Out on the Capitol steps, the late afternoon sun was cutting across the stone like a spotlight. The crowd waiting outside wasn't just reporters now. It was aides, staffers, tourists who had heard the commotion and lingered, and people who looked like they had been standing there for hours, waiting for this exact moment. They weren't holding signs, they weren't chanting. They were just watching, quiet, as she stepped into view. The air was heavier out here, but the silence felt different from the hallway. This was not the hush of surprise, it was the stillness of attention. A reporter in the front row tried again, raising his voice to be heard over the clicking shutters. "Congresswoman, are you saying the system is broken?" The question wasn't a trap this time. It was an opening. She could have gone into policy points, legal language, the kind of answer that kept her safe but forgettable. Instead, she stopped on the top step, the sunlight burning a sharp line across her face, and looked out over the crowd. "Broken?" she said, her voice firm but calm. "No. Broken is when you can't fix something. This question mark. This can still be fixed. But only if we stop pretending the people in power are the only ones who get to decide what's real." Her words didn't ring like slogans. They carried the weight of someone who had sat in too many rooms where the truth was treated like an inconvenience, something to file away instead of face. A man in the crowd nodded slowly, almost involuntarily, like he wasn't agreeing with her as much as recognizing what she said. That was the shift she had always been aiming for. Not applause, not viral clips, but recognition. The kind that spread quietly but dug deep. She knew the truth didn't always win by being loud. Sometimes it won by being undeniable. She took a breath and scanned the faces in front of her. There were young staffers barely old enough to rent a car, older aides who had lived their careers inside these walls, and a few people in worn jackets and work boots who looked like they'd walked a long way to stand there. "The real danger," she continued, "isn't bad laws or bad leaders. It's the silence we give them to work in." Her tone never rose, but the air around her felt charged. It was the kind of moment where people didn't just listen. They leaned in. From somewhere to her left, a voice, maybe a student, maybe just someone braver than the rest, called out, "But what can we do?" The question cut through the heavy stillness, raw and urgent. Jasmine didn't hesitate. She pointed, not at them, not at the cameras, but at the steps they were standing on. "Start here. Start by not letting this place decide what you're allowed to care about. Ask questions they don't want to answer. Hold on to the facts when they try to make you forget. That's how you keep the door open for the truth to walk through." The response wasn't applause. It was a wave of something quieter but stronger. Murmurs, nods, the shuffling of people turning to each other to repeat what they just heard. That was always the sign, not the cheers, the murmurs, the sound of a message taking root. She could see it happening in real time, in the way people's eyes shifted, in the way they began to look past her toward the doors she had just walked out of, as if they could see the machinery behind them and realize it wasn't untouchable after all. She didn't try to give them hope wrapped in a bow. Hope, she knew, was not the same as certainty. "There's a lie we've been sold," she said, her voice dropping lower, making people strain just enough to hear. "That power is something you either have or you don't. But the truth is, they only have it because you hand it to them, and you can take it back." It wasn't theater. It was a warning and a promise. Her security detail shifted again, reminding her it was time to move. But Jasmine didn't break eye contact with the crowd until she had finished. "We don't need genius. We need truth. And truth doesn't work unless all of us are willing to carry it." The words landed differently now, out in the open air, away from the echo of marble halls. They felt heavier here, anchored not by the moment but by the people holding it. She stepped down the stairs, each footfall slow and deliberate. Behind her, the reporters were already calling out more questions, trying to drag her back into the noise. But the crowd wasn't looking at the press anymore. They were looking at each other. Something had shifted. Not everything. Not enough to rewrite the rules overnight, but enough to make the next move matter. And in a place like this, that was the most dangerous shift of all. At the bottom of the steps, a little girl in a red hoodie stood with her mother, clutching a worn paperback book. She didn't say anything, just watched Jasmine pass. But Jasmine caught her eye, and for a split second, the noise, the cameras, the weight of the fight ahead, all of it fell away. That was the point, she thought. Not winning the room, not surviving the hearing, but leaving something that outlived the moment. When she reached the waiting car, she didn't collapse into the seat. She sat forward, elbows on her knees, staring straight ahead as the door shut. The city was still humming outside, sirens in the distance, tourists on the sidewalks, staffers rushing to make their next meeting. But inside the car, it was still. She replayed the last hour in her head, not for mistakes or missed opportunities, but for the one thing she had promised herself she would always check for. Did it matter? The answer, she knew, wasn't in the headlines. It wasn't even in the reaction of the crowd. It was in whether the people who heard her today would remember her words when the next headline tried to make them forget. It was in whether the next time someone told them to stop asking questions, they'd remember they didn't need permission to keep asking. That was the real measure of winning. And that was the human truth she had been carrying all along. The fight isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being the one who refuses to look away. Power counts on fatigue, on distraction, on the slow erosion of outrage. The only thing that stops it is the refusal to forget. And that refusal isn't born from genius. It's born from choosing to care, again and again, even when it's easier not to. As the car pulled away, she glanced back at the steps, at the shrinking shape of the crowd. Somewhere in that cluster of faces, someone was already telling the story to someone else, and that was enough. Not because it was a victory, but because it was proof. Proof that the truth, once spoken, doesn't belong to the person who said it. It belongs to everyone who's willing to carry it forward. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.